Well, you've seen the title. We were going to exchange a little bit with Miles on a very, very inspiring topic that we both really enjoy. And so I won't say too much, but we kind of divided ourselves, if we could be divided in that way, on those two different doorways of exploring the spiritual path, which is a direct path or a sudden path. And actually it was your idea, Miles. So would you just tell us why? Because you were so quick. I said, what would you want to speak about? And like, woof, gradual and sudden path. It was
no,
like...
Yeah. No, because I guess it was, I mean, it's something that's been, how do I say? From a certain perspective, you know, from, let's say, certainly a beginner's perspective, they seem like contradictory paths. And sometimes, let's say, from a more, I don't know, ethnocentric perspective, they can be in competition. It's like these two spiritual paths, these two spiritual truths, these two paths towards some type of absolute awakening are in conflict or contradiction. Actually, they're not, but that happens quite a bit. And I suppose, you know, I think when you and I did a talk about a year and a half ago that I recorded with you, we did touch on that, you know, because my background is much more the gradual approach, and we could call it a dualistic, whereas your background is more the non-dual approach. And I think it's also certain orientations that we have, that, like types, that's just what drew us. So it just seemed like a nice thing to open up, because I think there's a lot to unpack and explore there. So that's
Yep, you're right. Yeah. So would you like to start to tell us a little bit about how you see the gradual path, or what's...
Okay, sure. Well, first I want to say thank you very much for the invitation. It's really nice to be with your group here live today, and for whoever's watching the replays, of course, welcome. And my own background is it's also, you know, I know Dominique first through Aikido, but, you know, she's part of a group of a subgroup in the Aikido world that are also, I would say, seekers or seeking some type of spiritual awakening, and see the practice of Aikido as a vehicle for that, as one of many vehicles for that. Whereas not everybody in the art of Aikido is interested in that, and that's fine. But because Dominique also had that orientation, it you know, created a certain bond that you get when you're practicing in Sangha. You know, when you have a community of practitioners who are also dedicated or committed to, you know, some absolute awakening or absolute truth, or whatever we want to call it. And our Aikidos has also kind of manifested slightly different, because Dominique is much more, as I understand, or as I see Dominique, you know, she does have a developmental practice, and you know, I've known her for years, so I've seen her go through her ranks and tests and etc. But she's always been, you know, into that direct awakening. What's happening in the Aikido? What's the essence of the spiritual essence of Aikido right here and right now? And that's something that drew her and attracted her. And that also attracted me and drew me, but I was much more the developmentalist, you know, and for better and worse. I'm speaking in my case now, you know. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of unpack what those two things are, not what those two things are. I'm going to speak more about the gradual path of development. And you could, if you look at kind of if you look at a bit of a panoramic view of all spirituality or spiritual traditions in the world, some of them are gradual developmental approaches, and some of them are direct approaches. And you know, the direct approaches being, you know, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, the goal is here and now, and we are already awake, we are already enlightened, we just don't realize it, and it can only be realized in the here and now, and that's there's definitely a truth to that. And at the same time, there's these developmental practices that, you know, you take on a practice, you work with the teacher perhaps, and over a period of time you go through a series of stages, developmental stages that the teachers guide you through. And if you look at these two things, there's a beautiful parable of the frog and the fish, perhaps you've heard it before, that really points to these two approaches. And the parable is, there was a frog sitting on the bank of a river. Two fish swim by in the water, and the frog says to the fish, "How's the water?" One fish looks at the other fish and said, "What's water? What's this guy talking about?" And that's the direct approach. There is no inside, there is no outside, there is no water, there is no land, there is no air, there's no frog, there's no fish. It's like, huh? It's just like, this is this suchness of life. And yet the frog's approach is also valid because he's on the outside, he's observing. It's very much a dualistic stand. He's on the bank observing the water and in a way asking what is the essence of water. And you will, from the bank, the only way you can understand the essence of water is to get in the water. That's a fact. But you can tell how much the water, what's the temperature of the water, how fast is it flowing, how deep is it, that can only be understood from the outside. So there's always an inside and an outside. There's always a subjective view, and there's always an objective view. And many of the approaches that for example, certainly the early form of Buddhism, the Buddha's original teachings of enlightenment even were developmental. So enlightenment was not just this thing, but there were 4 stages of enlightenment, and each stage was a further purification of consciousness, a deeper and deeper purification of consciousness. And these stages, for example, the early form of Buddhism, by the way, my background is Vipassana meditation, which is a gradual approach, which is a developmental approach. In other words, there's 16 stages of developmental insight knowledge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that you go through, and you're guided accordingly. And you can, in the midst of the practice, you never know. There's no such thing as, oh, I'm at this stage. In the midst of the experience, it's just experience. But looking back, you can say, oh yeah, I went through these stages. And a teacher guiding you can actually understand that there's a predictability in how the practice will unfold, according to everybody's individual, in a way, karma. So they can guide you according to that. And those traditions that use some types of stages are gradual approaches because they're dualistic. You're here, the goal is there, and as you progress through these stages, you'll get closer and closer to the goal. Now, there's a lot that we have to say about this, but some of those traditions, for example, are like Vipassana meditation, where there's 16 stages of developmental insight knowledge. In Zen, there was a teacher named Tozan. Tozan had the 5 stages, and it was a metaphor of climbing to the peak of the mountain. You start at the bottom. You're in the relative, completely, let's say, ignorant to awakening, and you get a glimpse, a little peak of the absolute. And then you take on a practice, and you start to stabilize that experience of the absolute until you reach the peak of the mountain, and then you're in the absolute. But that's still not, it's not over yet. There's still 2 more stages. One stage is starting to come down, where you start to realize the relative inside the absolute. And then the complete awakening is when the relative and the absolute can come together as one. Those are 5 developmental stages. And also in Christianity, like in meditation, I know that Eileen knows of Saint Teresa of Avila. She teaches about she taught about the interior castles, and there were 7 dwelling places that you would progress through. And these are stages that, some people might say that they are man-made, that a human being invented these stages, which is kind of true. But actually, there were experiences that people went through, and they look back, they realized that they realized that you could make a map out of it. And also working with others, you realize that there's kind of a blueprint to consciousness, that it unfolds on a spiritual path. It unfolds in a predictable way according to the methodology. And that's important, that the methodology does matter. And what I want to speak about now, and what I'll do later in a guided meditation, is the specific methodology that that is my background, Buddhist meditation, specifically Vipassana, where the main practice is mindfulness. And mindfulness can, even in Buddhism, it's kind of described in different ways, but if we look at the Buddhist psychology, the Abhidhamma, the Buddhist psychology definition of mindfulness, we'll start to see that mindfulness is a dualistic practice. In other words, there's a part of my mind that observes objects. So there's the observer and there's the observed. That's a dualistic practice. And from the Abhidhamma, the definition of the Abhidhamma is Buddhist psychology. The definition of mindfulness is threefold. The first is its characteristic, and the characteristic of mindfulness is that it sinks. So whenever you activate mindfulness, you say, okay, let's be mindful. Whatever you do, you become mindful and you become aware of the situation, and that awareness deepens. If you continue to be aware, there'll be a continuous deepening. It doesn't matter if you're aware of your interior, if you're aware of another person in conversation, if you're meditating, if you're listening to a sound, you become aware or mindful of that sound, you're knowing of that object. Your mindfulness is just knowing of experience. So you're knowing of the experience, you're knowing of the object of experience, you're knowing of the object of observation will sync. And that's the characteristic of mindfulness. When mindfulness slips away, we come back up to the surface. When we activate it again, we deepen. So that's the characteristic. So it's, again, that's a dualistic definition, that I was here and it deepens. I lose my mindfulness, it goes back to the surface. So that's one part of the definition. The next part of the definition is the function of mindfulness. And the function of mindfulness is that it keeps the object of observation in view. So let's say your breath, you're breathing in, you're breathing out, and you're observing the breath, or just a metronome, for example. You're observing the breath, is that your mindfulness can actually stay with that. And what usually happens in our practice, for those who are meditators, I guess everybody here is a meditator, we watch one breath or two breath or three breath, and our mind kind of slips away. So then we pull it back, or we become aware of that, and we come back to our breath. And again, so this definition clearly shows that in this practice, or in this tradition, this approach, is dualistic, because there's a part of the mind that stays with the breath or the object that's observed. The third part of the definition from Buddhist psychology of mindfulness is the manifestation, how mindfulness manifests. And the way it manifests is that it fully meets, or the actual translation is confronts, or confrontation, not in a what do you say, a struggle or a conflict meaning, but it's one front to another front. So, for example, if you're walking down the street and you see somebody you just know, you might say hi and keep walking. But if you see a close friend, you stop and you're face to face, and you actually meet that person fully. So mindfulness it meets fully the experience. So I'm not just kind of halfway watching my breath and then thinking of something or listening to sounds. One mind, one object. So whatever the object is, I fully meet and confront the object, the breath, a sound, a thought, a sensation in the body. So this is the threefold definition of mindfulness from early Buddhism, from Buddhist psychology, the Abhidharma. And you can see that each part of that definition, the characteristic, the manifestation, and the function, it's the function and the manifestation, are dualistic definitions. So now I'm not saying that there are probably people out there, traditions that teach mindfulness as a non-dual, and that's totally fine. But I'm just saying, from that tradition, within that teaching, it's clearly a dualistic practice. So you use the duality, use the subject-object duality to take you further along the stages of insight knowledge. It actually moves you through the stages. The actual transition from the stage to stage is always non-dual. So in other words, if I'm saying, oh, I'm in this stage and I'm looking for that stage, you'll never get there. There has to be a letting go of duality at some point. You absorb so deeply into the experience that subject-object come together, and then something shifts. And the last thing I'll say about this, Dominic, and I'll pass it on, this is just kind of an overview of the way that I see kind of the gradual approach. One way to look at it is, I made a little chart here, that it's a vertical development. You could also say it's horizontal, but it doesn't really matter. But I move from the first stage to the second stage to the third stage to the fourth stage. Okay, sure. It's a nice map to have, and it's very helpful. If it's too mental, then remember, thinking is not meditation. So if you're thinking about the map and you're where am I in the practice, that's not meditation, of course. But looking back, I can say, oh yeah, I was like I have two daughters now, and my oldest daughter, she's 5. She's in the last year of kindergarten, and she's different than she was in the previous year of kindergarten. She has different capacities, she's really a big girl now. So I can look back and I say, oh wait, she's going through stages, and my youngest daughter, who's 1, she's in those early stages, and so there is a kind of a developmental thing. It's clear this is real from the frog's perspective. From the fish is like, what are you talking about? I don't know, what? It's just here and now. What do you mean? But from the frog's perspective, this is real. Another way to kind of work with this, and it's helpful to also see it not as just a one-direction approach, but as a cycle of discovery. So there's still the 5 stages here. I think it's So let's say you start at number one. I'm trying to see. You start at number one and you work to number two and then three. I have to look this way. You go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and you come back around to stage one. You know, so like you might have heard many times in practices, Shoshin no Nimodoru, they say in Japanese, return to the beginner's mind. Always return to the beginning. And every time you go around the cycle, you will return to the beginning, but you'll know it as if, who said it? Oh, forgive me, Thoreau, not Thoreau. Wordsworth or something, you know, you return to the beginning as if you know it for the first time because you're knowing it in a deeper way. So every time you go through this cycle, you'll know it deeper and deeper and deeper. But you'll also notice that here in the middle, that this is dualistic. Stage one, stage two, it's a dualistic approach and it deepens. But you'll notice that here in the middle, if we're talking about the non-dual traditions, and I'll start to kind of hand this over to Dominique, this is what they're talking about. And you can go around this forever using a method or using a technique, and you'll never get here. You just keep going around. So to get to the non-dual approach, something else has to happen. And that something else is that you have to let go of dualities. You have to let go of methodologies. And there was a famous golfer in America, I think in the 40s or something like that, or the 50s. His name was Gary Player. You know, he was like the Tiger Woods of his days. He was the best. And he was practicing all the time. He practiced more than anybody, and he was clearly the best. And a reporter had asked him, you know, Mr. Player, how come you're so good? And his answer was, I don't know, I guess I'm just lucky. And the reporter said to him, what do you mean how can you say you're lucky? You practice more than anybody else. And he said, yeah, right, but the more that I practice, the luckier I get. So you go around and around and around, and you get lucky in terms of dropping into this, whatever the non-dual is. And there is an old saying in spiritual communities that enlightenment is an accident, or awakening is an accident, and meditation makes you accident prone. And I don't know if the word accident prone translates, but it translates into French or whatever, but accident prone means that, you know, my little daughter, she's always dropping something because she's still developing. So, you know, she's prone to have accidents or pull something down or whatever. And that's just how she is. But enlightenment, there's nothing you can do to get enlightened. There's nothing you can do to get to that center of the circle. In fact, it's only stopping that somehow makes it happen. And like Gary Player said, the more you practice, the luckier you'll get. So that's kind of my hit on the two. And what I'll do is in a little bit, when I do a guided meditation, I'll give a little more detail about a specific method that we use with mindfulness. Dominique?
Well, that brings me to first to a question before continuing and speaking more of a continuation of the non-dual perspective. But you're describing that, you know, there's this practice in circle, and then there's moments of non-dual moments are happening that leads to a different stage. In your tradition, do they say that actually you'll gradually get to a full realization, or that you practice and practice, and then on the side of it, awakening might happen, or like what you're saying, like, is it a non-dual moment happening into something which is dualistic?
Yeah, it's both, because that's a karmic thing. Like even if you look at the life of the Buddha, his story, that's this kind of hero's journey, this kind of mythic story. When he finally reached his enlightenment, it was forever and always. There was nothing else to do. Done. And then he just, for the next 35 years of his life, he just shared the Dharma. So it seems like some people that is possible for, karmically speaking, some people, they wake up and that's it. They're awake. It's fully mature. For the average person, there's a gradual development and a gradual enlightenment, let's say, or a maturity of the awakening. And even, for example, in the Theravada traditions, the so-called enlightenment, there's 4 stages. And each stage is a deeper purification. There's very specific mental imperfections that get uprooted with each stage of awakening. And the first one is it takes a lot of practice to get there, but it's you know, there's certain, like, for example, greed and hatred get cut in half, but they don't get uprooted in that first stage of awakening. So that, you know, your let's say your egoic tendencies, or the unskillful mental emotional states that we all kind of work with in life, hopefully, they're still there, but you just have certain ones are completely gone. Others you still want to work with them, and within each stage there's a further purification, and what we would consider kind of the classic idea of like of an enlightened being are the third and fourth stage of awakening in the Theravada tradition. They're where greed and hatred are completely uprooted by the third stage and fourth stage. So the last, it gets quite technical with all the actual purifications that happen at that point. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it is. It's beautiful, because as I listen to you, it kind of comforts the understanding that I have that actually even gradual is not completely gradual. There are non-dual events happening in it which are not gradual. They're not predictable. Right. They're not controllable. They just happen. They're grace.
Yeah, grace. And, exactly.
And it's a gradual process mingled with sudden events.
Right.
And actually, it's really the same way when you look at a lot of non-dual teachings. They just reverse the focus.
The emphasis.
So first, it's sudden, but then in the meantime, there's a process. And it's nice to see that actually they're not at all, when I listen to you, it's not at all in opposition with what I'm understanding and experiencing of non-dual practices. It is the first emphasis changes. For example, Ramana Maharshi, or in the Kashmir Shaivism tradition, in many non-dual teachers, they'll first tell you the absolute taste. You are already awake. You are Brahman. What you are is what you've been looking for, is what is. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to go. You cannot go back home because you are home. So they'll start with that. And then when you don't get it, they'll be like, okay, in the meantime, why don't you work on prana, or work on your mind, or work on your mindfulness, or work on this, repeat mantra or whatever. But they first start with the highest teaching, because some people actually do realize it right there. And then if you're not, then they would scale down.
Right.
And so Ramana Maharshi would always first meet people in silence. And if you got it, you got it. If you didn't get it, he'll be like, okay, look within, look for the I. And then if you get that part, good. And then you still didn't get it, and you say, well, can I do some mantra? He'll be like, sure, do some mantra. And it's this nice adaptation to where the person is at its edge for a new discovery, for going slightly more deeply. For me, the model I love the most is actually one way to speak of it, that Bill Swamiji, who's Susan Swamiji's father, who's an amazing guide and teacher, he would say that there's two different processes. One is becoming a better person, becoming a better mind. So getting rid of bad tendencies and bad habits, ambition, fear, greed, envy, all of that, and becoming more and more, in the Hindu tradition, they say sattvic, more and more pure, aware, loving, compassionate, present, giving, a better and better human mind. And he said, and that's a process, and it's a beautiful process, but it has nothing to do with awakening. Awakening is in a different ballpark, he would say it like that. So there is something quite magical. I love the word grace, but something that happens, and we cannot plan it, we cannot teach it, we cannot even explain it, really. And it's this moment of grace where something happens, or something stops happening. That would be a better way to say it. A nice analogy is waking up is a little bit like falling asleep. If you think of, how do you do to fall asleep? Well, you don't know, right? You go to bed, you turn off the lights, you make it a quiet space. That's the gradual path. That's all you can do. But then something happens, right? And you fall asleep. You close your eyes and poof. And then a few hours later, you're like, oh, I fell asleep. it happened. And there's no doubt it happened. There's a complete certainty of it and a taste of it, but you can't really grab it. You can't really grasp it and say, well, I actually lifted my consciousness into a different realm of brain waves, and then they reached this, you know, you can't describe it. It's a mystery. And it's a mystery we all know. We all know it as the most intimate of events, actually. Same thing for awakening. It's a mystery, and we all know it. Because actually, we've all had or have had many moments of what we could call some awakening. We've had many moments where the identity disappears, where there's no me, there's no world, where there's complete perfection, and there's this certainty of beingness, and it transcends my story, it transcends what's happening in the world, it transcends how I feel, it transcends everything. It's just absolute perfection. Those moments, we know them well, but we don't call it like that. Those moments, they happen when we're in a moment of intimacy with a friend or with a lover. They happen when we're in front of a beautiful landscape in nature. They happen when we have a beautiful meal, we taste the food. There's all those moments where there's a possibility for something to shift, and it's not about me, and it's not about the world. There's something else that fills the whole space, a moment of complete recognition. So we all know that really well. We just get confused. We believe that it is the beautiful partner or the friend, that it is the landscape, that it is the nice taste, that it is something external that brought a moment of happiness. But actually, it's the opposite. It's because all of those disappeared that we got in touch with something that we know so well and that we know intimately, doubtlessly. So those moments we know, in the Hindu tradition, they call it kshanik samadhi. Kshanik is instantaneous. So they're instantaneous glimpses into a deeper knowing. And how do they happen? Well, ask yourself the question, when you're looking at a beautiful view and suddenly there's this perfect silence of beauty, how does it happen? Well, you have no idea. You can't do it. You can't make yourself feel close to someone and love. You can't make yourself being in awe in front of beauty. You can't make yourself fall asleep. But it happens. So that would be a way I would speak of it. And I'm looking at the time because I would really love that we have lots of time for meditation. So I'm going to stop here. Anyway, but so I'm really, when you speak and I speak, Miles, I really see that actually there's only one process, different, but there's something that we do and then something we can't do.
Right. And they're both, and they both, well, I mean, it's like the finger pointing to the moon. I couldn't say they're both absolute. They both point to an absolute perspective. And the taste of that absolute will be determined by the method or the non-method, as the case may be, that one is using. And in a way, you could say it's like two sides of the same spiritual coin. You know, the dualistic or the gradual approach and the sudden approach to awakening. So do you want to do a little guided meditation now?
That would be lovely. But not you, do you want to start? You guide us, and then I directly, but maybe we do something continuous. So when you ring, you guide as long as you want, and then you'll ring the bell, and then I'll guide the whatever end time we have.
That sounds nice. So
everybody's experienced meditators, by the way.
Right.
So they in one domain or another, I think. So
All right, so if we just look at, and again, this is coming out of a specific tradition. It's the Mahasi tradition of the Burmese, Mahasi school, the Burmese tradition of Vipassana meditation. And mindfulness, as I spoke about before, you know, this is the basic quality of mindfulness is that it's syncing. So if you feel in with yourself right now, we're 37 minutes into this session. Do you feel in a deeper place or a more superficial place? So if you were being mindful, if you were focusing, if there was concentration, attention, you'll probably feel in a bit of a deeper place. And that's just the syncing quality of mindfulness. And there's three phases. When we get down to the actual practice of this, there's three phases of mindfulness. And the first one is remember, mindfulness is knowing of experience, it's cognition, this not thinking, but knowing, this direct knowing of experience. And the first phase is knowing what it is, what the experience is. You don't have to analyze and say, oh, it's a thought, it's a breath, etc. It's just this direct knowing. That's the first phase. The second phase in this practice is, the first phase is what are you knowing? What is it? The second phase is what's happening to it. Because if you really observe something, you'll start to observe the universal nature of impermanence, that it's not staying the same. Then there's nothing fixed. There's no solid fixed experience. Experience is always flowing. It's always changing. So the first phase is what is it? The second phase is the second phase, is what are its characteristics? So you know it's the breath. What is the characteristic? It's a short breath. It's a long breath. It's a hard breath. It's a soft breath. It's an easy breath. It's a difficult breath. It's going up and down. It's going this way. You'll know the breath, and then you go a little bit deeper. You'll know its characteristics. And the third phase is what happens to it. What is it? What are its characteristics? And what happens? Again, that's dualistic. There's three phases here. What is it? What are its characteristics? And what happens? So for example, if I just show you this, what is it? It's a toy turtle. From our kids' aikido class. It's a toy turtle. I use this quite a bit. What are its characteristics? Just look at it. What are its characteristics? Dominique, you want to say a couple of things about what are some of the characteristics of this?
You mean the shape, the color?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, lost you. Yeah, the shape, the color, the movement of it, the play of the light on it.
Right, yeah, it's shiny, it's brown on top and whatever, beige on bottom, it's moving, etc. So that's the characteristics. And if you observe, you'll know it. And if I held it up here for 15 minutes, you would know, and you kept observing it, you would know it, the characteristics deeper and deeper and deeper. And then what happens to it, let's say it turns or something like that. So those three phases are what we're doing with mindfulness practice, with mindfulness meditation practice. Let's say you take the breath as the object, for example. You know it's a breath. You know the characteristics. It's a long breath or short breath or whatever. And you know what happens to it. What is it? What are its characteristics? What happens? What is it? What are its characteristics? What happens? And again, it's not an analytical exercise. I'm not analyzing my breath. I'm just being with the breath and knowing it as the breath, knowing it as a short or a long breath, for example, and knowing what happens. If it was short, it became long. If it was long, it became short. So you start to see the development or the progress of the object that you're observing. And the only way you can do that is if you stay with it with mindfulness, moment to moment to moment. Okay, and that requires to be concentrated moment to moment to moment. This moment and this moment and this moment. Again, it's a dualistic moment by moment process. So I'll do a short guided meditation.
Why don't you do a 15 minutes, about 15 minutes?
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, so I'll speak maybe for 5 minutes into it, and then we will I'll bring us out of it towards the end. So go ahead and find a comfortable position, eyes closed or open as you like. Take a moment and feel the body, and just knowing the sensations in the body. Again, you don't have to analyze or search. Whatever the dominant physical experiences are, they will come directly to your mind. Noticing if those physical sensations are on the pleasant side, or if they're on the unpleasant side, or if they're somehow neutral. And just directly knowing the sensations in the body. And now shift your awareness to your general feeling. Feeling in the body, feeling in the mind, feeling in the emotions. And when I say general, just generally noticing if you feel more on the pleasant side. Generally noticing if you feel more on the unpleasant side. Or generally noticing if your feelings are neutral. And see if you can observe the feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, as an object of meditation. There's a location in the mind-body somewhere. There's a boundary somewhere. In other words, this part of me feels unpleasant. That part of me doesn't feel unpleasant. And there's somewhere in between, there's a boundary. And generally noticing and staying with the feeling as an object of observation. Knowing it, knowing its characteristics, and as you continue to observe it, knowing what happens. And now gently shifting your observation to the mind and knowing the quality, condition of the mind. Is the mind busy? Is it relaxed? Is there some contraction? Is it more open? Is there restlessness? Are there doubts arising in your mind? I don't know about this gradual approach. Doubting the method, doubting the teacher, doubting Zoom, doubting your internet connection, whatever can be coming up in the mind. Perhaps there's planning or thinking or regrets, desires, fears, aversions. Not having a preference for what's arising in the mind, not manipulating anything that's arising in the mind, being mindful, openly accepting, and simply knowing the conditions of the mind. What is the condition? What are the characteristics? And as you continue to observe moment by moment with mindfulness, what happens? Do you notice an unfolding, transformative nature of the mind? Remembering that there's only one mind and one object at a time, that anything that arises in the body, physical sensation-wise, can be an object of meditation. Anything that arises in your feelings can be an object of observation. And anything that arises in the mind, a thought, an image, a mental state, can be an object of observation. Knowing that you are free to move into this open field of observation, let's direct our attention now to the breath and using the breath as an anchor. to keep us, in a way, anchored to the present moment, knowing that you're free to observe anything in the body, in the mind, whatever. For now, with this threefold process of knowing what is it, what are its characteristics, and what happens, observing the breath with mindfulness as you breathe in, observing the breath with mindfulness as you breathe out, and allowing the mindfulness to deepen with each moment of knowing. Allowing the mindfulness to deepen with each moment of understanding the characteristics in the breath. And allowing the mindfulness to deepen through moment-to-moment observation of what is happening with the breath. Is it staying the same? Is the sameness becoming more rigid and stronger? Is it changing? Is it developing? Do you feel like your practice is deepening? Do you feel like the practice is getting more challenging, more difficult? Is a preference arising in the mind for a pleasant practice? Is an aversion arising in the mind towards or against an unpleasant practice? Just knowing the breath, knowing and noticing its characteristics, long, short, full, shallow, smooth, rough, easy, difficult. Being mindful without manipulation. And knowing what happens as you continue to observe the breath with mindfulness, with each breath, in each moment, moment to moment, breath by breath. And bringing your mindfulness back to the breath, knowing the characteristics of the breath, and knowing what happens as you observe. Bring your mindfulness back to the body and the physical sensations that arise to the mind through observation of the body, knowing the quality or the characteristic of those sensations, and knowing what happens to those sensations as you observe. Bring your mindfulness back to the feelings, the general effects that you feel in the body of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, knowing its quality, and knowing what happens as you continuously observe moment by moment. Bringing your attention to the mind, knowing the quality, characteristic of the mind, and knowing what happens as you continue to observe. And returning to the breath, being mindful of the breath with each breath in each moment. Being mindful of the inside, and as you slowly open your eyes, being mindful of the outside.
We'll stay in the practice with a different doorway. Keeping the eyes open or closed, it doesn't matter. Keeping a straight posture or relaxing it, it doesn't really matter. And for a moment to allow yourself to forget everything you think you know about yourself, the world, about spirituality, meditation, and awakening. As you fall into this forgetfulness, all the intent or expectations will fade away. There is nothing to get, to become, no need to evolve or for anything to change. It's like taking the deepest holiday ever. and to simply rest. To continuously relax. The sense of falling. Falling towards yourself. If you had to take a step closer to yourself, where would you go? Go rest as closely as possible to yourself, where you know you are. The place that you know you're at peace. The place from which you love or taste beauty. Just go home. Go where you are, home. Starting to breathe more deeply. Go at your own rhythm to come back into movement. Stretching the body. We'll meet in a couple of minutes. She can say no. Susan, would you share something about that topic, about what you spoke about, or anything I'm sure you would have, for 5 hours nonstop to speak, but I would love to hear you.
Well, I just found it very, very interesting listening to both of you. It's very foreign to me. And because I have no idea if in our ashram, there's actually no technique, nothing explained in the way you explain it, especially Miles, the way you explain it in such detail of how you do the Vipassana and so forth.
Right.
But one thing is that, I mean, when you think of gradual and maybe gradual and sudden, or gradual or absolute, maybe. Even as a child, I had this feeling everything is God's will, no matter what. So it's a very absolute view. It's a very absolute view. And then when I came to the ashram, it gradually evolved to something like God alone is, or one reality alone is.
Beautiful.
Kind of the absolute truth. Now, that is in one sense sudden, but at the same time, it's gradual in the sense that you have to keep on practicing. So it's gradual and sudden at the same time, because it's like in the process itself, it results in a certain opening, and yet the opening closes again. And then it has to be done over and over again. So, but there's I have no idea of any particular methodology. It's like we were never taught any methodology here. I don't know if that makes any, does that ring true with you, Dominique, the time you spent in our ashram?
Well, I mean, your ashram is definitely more of the way you and Bill Swamiji would speak, it's definitely first a sudden path. So, Brahman alone is, without a second, and then do the work. First realize, right. And then get on the work to align with that, to not forget it, to embody it, to express it.
That's right. And you were mentioning Dad, and because I'm teaching his course now, and he talks about the way out of sorrow. That's the only Buddhist part, is the Four Noble Truths. But he talks about, when he speaks about the way out of sorrow, that it's the relative and the absolute. The relative being, becoming a good person, as you said, Dominique, and then the absolute, meaning absolute surrender, whatever way you do it, because all paths lead to it, or whatever. And when I remember sitting with Swami Brahmanandaji, he only taught Advaita Vedanta. He says, we assume when you come here, you're already a decent person. I mean, you're not robbing banks, you're not murdering, you're not, doing the normal world. That is already an assumption. So now it's time to transcend it. So that was, so then they would introduce us almost directly into the absolute teaching. And then again, it would have to be just practicing it over and over again. That would be more, but I found what both of you said very fascinating, and also, very helpful too. It was just, I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for that and for sharing. What you're saying brings up this kind of gradual, sudden, gradual. So gradual to become a better person. So you stop looking at elsewhere than on the path. So gradual to become a better person, to really get involved on the spiritual path. Then surrendering. And then practicing surrendering. So it's gradual, sudden, gradual. The way you speak of it, I really enjoyed, actually.
Yeah. Actually, the gradual, presumably by the time you come here, you're supposed to already be a decent person.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it's same with Buddhism.
I actually, when I'm following the outline of Dad's course, but when it comes to that relative way out of sorrow, I kind of say it comes in 3 stages. One is the enforced be good, do good, which is the morals and ethics we learn as children from our parents and school and whatever religion we're born into, if we're born into a religion. And then when you come to an ashram, right, or you become a spiritual seeker, it should be done with understanding. And in other words, that these morals and ethics are not something that should be imposed on you, but rather you should see that they actually flow from who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so as Swamiji says, what is the basis of morality? You could, the way he might say it, is that it's that unified, the consciousness that unifies all of us. So why are you kind to others? Because you're being kind to your own self. That's an example. Mm-hmm. So it becomes a deliberate spiritual practice rather than just a condition, be good, do good. At that phase, they're really done together.
So the gradual and the not.
Yeah, in other words, when you're talking about it, you have to say, okay, this is stage 1 and this is stage 2. But in actual fact, if you're practicing at, you know, the foundation here, which is non-injury, truthfulness, and purity, when you're practicing it, but you can also at the same time be practicing everything that's that, or
Are you practicing them at the same time? Okay. Ah, beautiful. Yeah, yeah. Ah, great. Thank you. Thanks for the sharing.